This meeting, or this video, I should say, is actually about industry analysis and Porter's Five Forces framework. So when we talk about industry analysis, what is the reason? What's a primary reason for us to go in to analyze an industry? It helps us to see what are the sources of profit in the external environment. And it is that competitive structure of the industry that determines its profitability. And after we analyze what are those sources of profit within the structure, then we have to ask ourselves, is this industry structure that determines who is going to be able to capture the profit that is generated in that industry, is this industry structure set in stone? Well, before we can determine if that industry structure is set in stone, we need to see what is that industry structure, what makes up that industry structure. And here we have the five forces diagram that Porter is actually famous for. What made Porter is this understanding, this concept of the five forces that shape industry competition. So here, what do we see? We see that we have rivalry among existing competitors, which is our greatest force. We have the force of the threat of new entrants. Not only do we have the threat of new entrants, we have the threat of substitute products or services, and we're really talking about the threat of close substitutes. We have the bargaining power of the buyers as well as the bargaining power of the suppliers. So when we talk first about the rivalry among existing competitors, what is it that we're talking about? Competition from these established existing rivals are the major determinant of profitability for the industry. And so what are those factors there that are involved? It's the number and size of the firms that are competing in the market. It's that concentration ratio of the firms. What is the combined market share of the leading producers? It's the diversity of those competitors. What are their origins? What are their objectives? What are their costs? What are their strategies? Are they profit related, or should we say, are they market share, or are they profit related? There is a different, or profit concerned or market share concerned. There's a difference in how you would go about trying to encroach upon their business terrain, depending upon whether they're market or market share or profit oriented. What is their product differentiation? Do they have highly differentiated products? If so, then highly differentiated products do what? They enjoy a weak price competition. Is there excess capacity in the market? What does excess capacity do? It encourages price cuts to attract new business. Are there barriers to exit? Not barriers to entry, but barriers to exit, especially for stakeholder countries. So for Europe, Asia, Africa, for example, South America, there is a much greater reliance on stakeholder relations than there is in North America, for example, that is shareholder relations. An example there is Brazil. When I worked in Brazil, Brazil is required to pay 2 months worth of severance to any employee that they lay off or they fire. So what does that do? Is that it prevents or prohibits or discourages, that's a better word, discourages Brazilian companies from hiring on new employees until they are absolutely sure that they can use those employees, that they will not lose money due to a market downturn, for example, because they have to pay out 2 months worth of severance. Also, what are the cost conditions? So when the fixed costs in an industry are high relative to the variable costs, then the firms in that industry will take on marginal business at any price that covers those variable costs. So think of the airline. So as long as you are covering your variable costs for the airlines will take that price. We also have our threat of new entrants. And so any industry where there is a higher rate of return on capital that is being generated, those industries do what? They act as magnets for firms that are outside of the industry. So industries that are protected by high barriers to entry will earn above average profits. So we can think of pharmaceuticals, we can think of cereals. What are some of those high barriers to entry? We can think, and what is a barrier to entry? So a barrier to entry is any advantage that established firms have over other entrants. And so some examples there are the capital. Capital is required to become established in an industry. Capital intensive companies and research intensive companies require large scale operations to be profitable. New product costs are expensive. The cost advantage of a new product requiring low source costs. So if you're trying to compete on cost, then your inputs must be lower than what is the established firm in the industry. If there is price differentiation, or I beg your pardon, product differentiation due to brand loyalty, that is a barrier to entry, as is access to channels of distribution. If those channels have been all snapped up and the new firms have a very hard time trying to get channels to distribution, that is a barrier to entry, as is government and legal barriers. When we talk about the threat of close substitutes there, the absence of close substitutes, so a product that is essentially performing the same function as the other product, so that would be a close substitute. So the absence of close substitutes causes relative demand in elasticity. So the consumers are comparatively insensitive to price, that the difference in the price is not going to sway them in their decision making. However, if you have the availability of close substitutes, then there is demand elasticity, which means that customers are much more willing to switch to a close substitute when the price of your product increases. So the more complex the product, the lower the substitution by customers on the basis of price. And again, think of a drug, for example. Also, when we look at the bargaining power of buyers, so bargaining power of buyers, who are the buyers? The buyers are the ones who buy your firm's products. So they are in the market for your firm's outputs. It's the ones who are buying the finished product of your firm. And so their price sensitivity, what does that depend upon? So the higher the price of a component item to the relative total cost of a finished good, then the more price sensitive the customer is going to be. The less differentiated the product, the more likely the client, or the customer, I should say, is willing to substitute another product for your product. So if there is very little differentiation, then the consumer is concerned more with price. If there is greater competition among the buyers themselves, then that will have a greater demand on price reduction from the seller. And then the more critical the firm's product is to the quality of the buyer's product, then the less sensitive the buyer is to the price. So if your product, if you are selling an intermediate product, if you're selling a component, and that component is critical to the buyer's end product, then his or her elasticity will be very low, because they need to have your very differentiated product. Also, we have what? The bargaining power of the suppliers. So when we speak about the bargaining power of the suppliers, who is it that we're speaking about? These are the entities that do what? They supply your company with inputs. So you as the company, the buying company, now you are in the market for their product. The suppliers provide your company with inputs so that your company can produce a finished product. So the suppliers provide those raw materials for you to produce your finished products. And so what is that relationship there? What is that power relationship? So here, the power depends upon how easily can you as the company, you as the firm, how easily can you switch suppliers? So how easy it is for you to go from one supplier to a different supplier. Also, the suppliers of sophisticated components have a higher bargaining power. So think of pilots unions, for example. They have a very sophisticated product, and they mass together, and as a group, they have a much higher bargaining power.